This video is brought to you by Squarespace, the all-in-one website platform. More about them later in this video. Welcome back to Geographics. I'm your host, Cosmic Horror Madman Eric Malachite, and today we're taking a mad journey discussing one of the most legendary prisons in all of France, the Bastille, with a script penned by the ever-factual Larry Holsworth. But without further delay, let's get started. The famed Parisian fortress, known as the Bastille de Saint-Antoine, or more simply and easier to say 50 times in a video, the Bastille was nearly 200 years old before citizens of Paris saw it turned into what was primarily a prison. Though it stood as a guardian of Paris for centuries, beginning with a bastion erected in the 14th century, it is remembered primarily today as the scene of the beginning of the French Revolution. On July 14, 1789, armed citizens of Paris stormed the citadel, murdered its commander, and freed the prisoners found within. There were only about 7 or 6 prisoners at the time. But we'll share some of their stories later on because, well, one of them is absolutely ridiculous. The storming is commemorated in France as Bastille Day, formerly called the Fête Nationale Française, or French National Celebration. And it's a pretty big deal, marked by speeches, music, and a military parade where the French Army marching band breaks it just all the way down for gathered dignitaries and officials. For example, here's a clip of them playing a medley of Daft Punk songs the editor picked for no other reason than they think Daft Punk kicks all kinds of ass and wanted to share it. Thanks, Karl. Anyway, though the event is celebrated, the Bastille itself is long gone, having been demolished by the people who overran it at the start of the Revolution. Only a few small pieces of its foundation stones remain today, relocated from where they once supported the battlements to places of honor nearby, including, get this, a model of the Bastille carved from a piece of it, which is just wonderfully meta. They also used a bunch of stones to make, among other things, souvenirs and a bridge. Now, most of the ground where the fortress once stood is occupied today by the Place de la Bastille. It is remembered in both histories and fiction as a medieval prison, with wretched unfortunates occupying its dungeons and stone cells. Torture devices, the rack, Iron Maiden, thumbscrews, and many others are part of its legacy, as are starving prisoners locked away and forgotten by time. In truth, many of the prisoners who occupied the Bastille at the whim of political enemies did so in relative comfort. Among them were the philosopher and writer Voltaire, who once aptly stated, "It's dangerous to be right when the government is wrong." The controversial Marquis de Sade, who was arrested multiple times throughout his life for, among other things, masturbating with religious paraphernalia whilst asking a prostitute to beat him with a fire poker, drugging women and then sniffing their farts and writing like so much on. And finally, there was also a man identified only by a cryptic entry on his death certificate. Some believe him to have been an illegitimate son of Louis XIV, the inspiration for the fictional Man in the Iron Mask by Alexandre Dumas. Dumas used the ancient fortress as a setting for several of his works, describing it variously as an exile of relative comfort to one in which the unfortunate prisoner was bankrupted, buried, destroyed. The Bastille played a significant role in A Tale of Two Cities by Charles Dickens, as did the slum of Saint-Antoine and its denizens. Dickens described imprisonment in the Bastille as being buried alive, and the effects of the imprisonment of one of his characters, Dr. Alexander Manette, is a major plot device of the novel. Because the fortress and most of its records was destroyed shortly after it was successfully stormed, much of its history is one of speculation, legend, myth, and outright fiction, at least as regards its function as a prison. Its history as a fortification protecting Paris isn't exactly stellar either. 7 times over the centuries, the fortress was besieged by enemies, leading it to surrender 6 times. Classic French move, right? Yet, its history spans the most turbulent periods of French history, as well as the most decadent, during the final decades of the monarchy and the reign of the nobility in France. The Bastille, long gone, remains emblematic of the excess of an autocratic government, under which any can be imprisoned without trial and without the protection of law. If you want your business to be as iconic as the Bastille, then you're going to need a fancy new website to get the word out, and today's sponsor, Squarespace, is just what you're looking for. Squarespace is the all-in-one website platform, perfect for entrepreneurs even if you're selling French Revolution memorabilia, and they've got all the tools you need to get the job done all in one place and on your terms. With Squarespace's next-generation website engine, the Fluid Engine, you'll be able to choose from a template and customize it to your heart's content. And unlike using an expensive web designer, your website will be fully functional on desktop and mobile as soon as you hit publish. With Squarespace's guided design system, Squarespace Blueprint, and their brand spanking new AI and SEO tools, you'll be able to pick from a curated list of layout and styling options to ensure you're able to build your brand the way you want from the ground up. And make sure your website hits all those SEO sweet spots, ensuring you reach the right people to grow your audience the way you want. And best of all, if you are looking to sell French Revolution memorabilia or anything else within reason, on your website, Squarespace offers flexible payment options with simple but powerful tools. Accept credit cards, PayPal, and Apple Pay. And in eligible countries, your customers will have the option to buy now and pay later with Afterpay and ClearPay. Ready to get started? Check out squarespace.com for a free trial. And when you're ready to launch, go to squarespace.com/geographics to save 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain. Now, back to the Bastille. From the mid-14th to the mid-15th century, France and England engaged in a series of religious and political conflicts known as the 100 Years' War, which, fun fact, actually lasted 116 years, which just doesn't have the same ring to it, I guess. The war also didn't rage for the entire 100-plus years, being punctuated by several periods of peace between the belligerents, with both sides taking time off to deal with a little thing called the Black Death. Now, the Paris of the time was a gated city, with defensive ramparts in places, and its chief position of defense was the Castle Louvre, which stood on the site of today's art museum of the same name. The Louvre loomed over the western areas of Paris, which grew steadily during the conflict, spreading to the east. By the early 14th century, the eastern areas of the city were too far displaced from the defenses offered by the Louvre. The deteriorating military situation and the capture of John II, who held the throne of France despite numerous other claimants to be the rightful king, led to the Provost of Paris in 1357 ordering the construction of two fortresses, one at Saint-Denis and the other at Saint-Antoine, both gateways to the eastern areas of the city. The fortress erected at Saint-Antoine consisted of two towers connected by a ditch nearly 30 meters across. Such a fortified gateway was known as a Bastille, or bastion. The provost, Etienne Marcel, changed his support from John II to Charles of Navarre, another claimant to the French throne, and was subsequently assassinated by members of the garrison at Saint-Antoine who believed he'd gone too far in his dislike of the king and was at risk of doing something very stupid. Namely, handing the city of Paris to the English, which of course meant he needed to be stabbed to death as quickly and thoroughly as possible. But the fortress he created remained, which is nice, we guess. In 1369, Charles V ordered the defenses expanded and reinforced. 6 new towers were erected, 2 backing the original towers, 2 erected to the north, and 2 more to the south. Walls connecting the new towers created a large fortress, surrounded by all sides by a moat filled by the Seine. The walls were constructed to the same height as the towers at 24 meters, and were 3 meters thick, faced with stone. Construction took about a decade, after which the Porte de Saint-Antoine, the gate to the city, was protected by a massive fortress, crenellated along its roofs and walls 68 meters wide and 37 meters across. The fortress was garrisoned and became an important part of the defenses of Paris during the remainder of the 100 Years' War, as well as the numerous conflicts which occurred in subsequent decades. It also became a place of refuge. Charles VII hid within the Bastille in 1418, while opposing French factions gleefully massacred each other in the city over the issue of which family held the right claim to the French throne. Charles VII eventually fled the Bastille, escaping Paris through the Porte de Saint-Antoine, though he returned almost 2 decades later. In the interim, England claimed the throne of France and occupied the Bastille with English troops. It was under Charles VII that the fortress was first used as a prison. Ironically, the first to be imprisoned within its dungeons, which were built beneath each of the 6 newer towers, was Hugues Aubrey, the man who built it. Aubrey incurred the displeasure of the supporters of Charles VII, was falsely accused of numerous crimes including sodomy and extortion, and in 1417 sentenced to life in prison in the Bastille's dungeon, with only bread and water for sustenance. Aubrey's fate after that is uncertain. He evidently was freed during subsequent rioting in Paris and fled to the city, vanishing from history. Our personal theory is that he fled to the sewers of Paris, which he also designed, and became some sort of Lovecraftian rat creature. The English garrisoned the Bastille and found it eminently suitable as a prison, placing numerous inmates there for both political purposes and for punishment for crimes not subject to prosecution as a capital offense. The English remained until Charles VII returned to Paris in 1436, after the Bastille was abandoned by the English and provided a refuge for the opponents of Charles VII until they were successfully starved out, having to pay ransom for the right to leave. The Bastille remained a key defensive position for the city of Paris throughout the remainder of the 15th century and throughout the 16th century as well. It also served as a royal palace with luxurious appointed apartments for the monarchs and their courts. At the same time, its use as a prison expanded, with prisoners in the dungeons occupying considerably less comfortable quarters. Escapes from the prison were not uncommon, usually by prisoners incarcerated for political purposes rather than for actual crimes. Escaping usually required bribing the guards. One such escapee was Antoine de Chabannes, who had many years earlier fought alongside Joan of Arc. Chabannes later obtained the title of Count of Demarta by marrying the widowed countess who held the title, and gained the extensive lands that went with it. Chabannes escaped from the Bastille in 1463, believed to have been the first to do so successfully, and went on to a long life of adventure and misadventure before his death in 1488. Another notable escapee was Henri Mazur de la Tour, who escaped from the Bastille by climbing up a chimney in his cell, after tearing apart the heavy steel grating covering it with his bare hands, and climbing down the walls with a makeshift ladder made from his own clothes. La Tour was subsequently arrested and escaped from prison several more times throughout his life and became a hero of the revolution due to his extensive time spent in prison by the government, with his writings, some of which were written in his own blood, becoming rallying documents for the common folk, as did his autobiography, though that's a story for another day. By the early 17th century, the fortress of the Bastille was no longer considered a significant part of the defense of Paris, though it retained its role as a residence for the monarch and as a prison. Louis XIII became King of France in 1610, though since he was just 9 years of age, his mother, Marie de Medici, ruled France as regent. Not exactly the doting type, de Medici would routinely beat or have servants beat her son, and once, to establish power, slapped him clean across the face in front of the entire royal court. Do you want a Joffrey? Because that's how you get a King Joffrey. In 1617, the young king, supported by his ministers, removed his mother as regent, exiled her from Paris, and had most of her advisors killed, with one being shot in the face in public by men acting on the young king's orders. Louis XIII was the second of the Bourbon kings, after his father Henry IV. For much of his reign, the true power behind the throne of France came from his advisor, Armand Jean Duplessis, Cardinal Richelieu. Now, Richelieu was, and remains, one of those figures of history both reviled by some and revered by others. He was instrumental in consolidating political power in France and the monarchy, forever ending the feudal states that existed prior to his tenure. The nobility became more aligned with the monarchy and the House of Bourbon, with rival nobles and their private armies subjugated to the throne. He did so through the unending support of the concept of the divine right of kings, absolute monarchy, and the suppression of dissent. He heavily censored the press as well as literature, poetry, theater, and music. In other words, he sucked. Under his direction, the first organized structure of the Bastille as a royal prison took shape, and it was during his tenure that the oldest known formal records of the prison began. In the late 17th century, the city of Paris underwent numerous changes. The ancient defensive walls surrounding the city were removed beginning in 1670, as were most of the supporting fortifications. The Bastille remained, towering over the neighborhood of Saint-Antoine, no longer used as a fortification but remaining as a state prison. Saint-Antoine grew into a densely populated residential and light industrial neighborhood, with many shopkeepers and artisans residing in apartments over their places of business. The Bastille accepted prisoners throughout the 17th and 18th centuries, nearly all of whom were imprisoned without trial and without immediate prospect of judicial intervention. The main device used to incarcerate prisoners there was a document known as the lettre de cachet, or a letter under royal seal. These were issued under the authority of the king, though they could be initiated by members of his court or any of his ministers who designated an unworthy as being a threat to his majesty or the state. Either way, as these things were considered to be a direct order from the king, you were shit out of luck options-wise upon being handed one. Go directly to prison, do not pass go, do not collect $200, that sort of thing. Most of the several thousand persons imprisoned in the Bastille over the years were charged in the lettre de cachet with vague crimes of a financial nature, or plotting against the king or violating censorship laws. Their arrests were a formal process, though they seldom led to legal proceedings such as indictment or trial. Many were incarcerated simply because they had, in some way or another, irritated the king or one of his ministers. For example, it's known that some nobles had their own children arrested, just for being annoying or acting in a way that brought their family name into disrepute. Hell, Voltaire was arrested just for writing an unflattering poem about the king and bragging about it to a party full of narcs. Nearly all of these miscreants were of the nobility or of the French upper class, financially well off and well known to the French people. It seems one needed to be known by the king in order to irritate him. Most of them had money, as well as influential friends, and their time in the Bastille was spent in rooms rather than dungeon cells, decorated with tapestries and comfortable furniture. They ordered their food from nearby shops, which included wine and other alcoholic beverages, so, you know, it was basically the pandemic for them. Some were attended by private servants throughout their incarceration, and many were joined by wives and mistresses in the prison. Prisoners arriving at the Bastille were subjected to search and weapons were removed from their possession. Prisoners were allowed to remain in their own clothes, and many entered the prison with extensive wardrobes as well as other items intended to make their stay a bit more comfortable. In addition to the political prisoners and those held simply because they had unwisely offended someone, those accused of spying on other nations were held in the Bastille. James Douglas, Lord Morton, and his entire family and household of servants were held in the Bastille in 1746 for a period of 3 months. Officially, his crime had been a failure to notify the French government of his address. In truth, he was suspected of being a spy for anti-royalist factions. He was returned to England upon his release. Then there's the famed man in the iron mask alluded to earlier, who is believed to be a real person, though he is said to have worn a mask of black velvet to hide his features rather than a choking iron one. Exactly who this man was is unclear, with theories ranging from an illegitimate heir of the king to a random Italian noble who really pissed off the king. We'll no doubt tell his story another time over on Geographics, unless we already have, in which case, go watch that. The prison authorities were paid directly from the king's own pocket, an amount for each prisoner, which varied based on the prisoner's rank in society. Leading nobles commanded the most money, and the amounts trended downwards to the most common laborer. The sum was intended to allow the prison authorities to maintain each prisoner in the lifestyle to which he or she was accustomed outside of the walls, at least as pertaining to diet and clothing. The prisoners also received medical care and were allowed religious counseling as long as the religion was Roman Catholic. In regards to this stipend, it was actually possible for prisoners to make money by simply not using up their daily ration of food or clothes or whatever and just keeping the allowance. I did this in middle school too. Spent it all on anime. In fact, some prisoners went as far as to request a later release just to continue collecting this money ahead of life outside. Getting out of the prison usually required the transfer of funds to ministers close to the king, who would then use their influence to allow the prisoner to be released into a form of exile. Exile often meant simply remaining away from Paris, though in some cases it required exile from France to foreign shores. Some prisoners were actually awarded pensions from the French government upon release, subject of course to reformed behavior and no longer offending the king or his ministers. Either way, all prisoners had to sign documents upon release saying that they'd never discuss what occurred during their incarceration, a fact that no doubt led to the prison's fearsome reputation. Meanwhile, as prisoners in the Bastille whiled away their time with books, strolls in the gardens within the bastion, and in some cases alongside the Seine outside the walls, the citizens of Saint-Antoine and other Paris suburbs bitterly noted the differences between the lives of the privileged and those of the poor working class. The Bastille itself, which stood on the Rue de Saint-Antoine, acted as a barrier between the fashionable neighborhood of the Marais and the rapidly deteriorating streets and buildings of Saint-Antoine. By the mid-18th century, it had come to symbolize the excess of the monarchy and the nobility, which were largely paid for by the excessive taxation imposed on the working class of Saint-Antoine and throughout France. In the intro, we mentioned several notable people held within the prison walls. So before we discuss the storming of the Bastille, it may be worth sharing the stories of some of the people held there in more depth, starting with François-Marie Arouet, better known as Voltaire, the French wit, writer, philosopher, and satirist. Now, Voltaire was imprisoned in the Bastille on April 17, 1726, having offended the sensibilities of the Chevalier de Rohan. It was a relatively short stay. On May 2, 1726, he was transferred under escort to Calais, and from there entered voluntary exile in England. He returned to France less than 3 years later, and though he was frequently threatened with further imprisonment, he managed to avoid a return to the Paris prison. Voltaire agreed to exile because he had experienced the Bastille before. In May 1717, he was delivered to the Bastille after it was discovered, as noted previously, that he was the anonymous writer of a bawdy poem which publicly humiliated Prince Regent Philippa. Voltaire's poem insinuated the prince was involved in an incestuous relationship with his young daughter. Gross. Philippa was especially sensitive to such insinuations since they were more or less true. Also gross. For that indiscretion, Voltaire spent 11 months in the prison, his condition monitored closely by the Prince Regent, who did not allow him many of the luxuries enjoyed by other prisoners. Hence, when it became time to return to the Bastille, Voltaire chose exile in England and paid bribes to ensure it happened. Donatien Alphonse François de Sade, after the death of his father in 1767, styled as the Marquis de Sade, was a French soldier, writer, libertine, and sexual predator whose last name gave the English language the word sadism. Unlike most of the prisoners held over the centuries in the Bastille, Sade had actually been convicted of several crimes and been held in several prisons before he was lodged in the Bastille. In 1777, he was held in Vincennes prison under a letter de cachet, convicted of numerous crimes including sedition, sodomy, blasphemy, and debauchery and immoderate libertinage. When Vincennes prison was closed by royal edict in 1784, Sade was transferred to the Bastille. He remained there until 1789, though the frequently found reports that he was in the prison when it was stormed by the citizenry that summer are untrue. During his incarceration, Sade frequently strolled on the walkways erected along the tops of the prison walls and often communicated with the citizens of Saint-Antoine far below. As tensions grew in Paris in the summer of 1789, the prison authorities decided that Sade's frequently inflammatory sermons directed towards the citizens were unhelpful. His privileges were curtailed and he was forced to remain in his rooms rather than exercise along the walls. Sade continued to berate the citizens of Saint-Antoine through the windows, using a megaphone he fashioned from paper. On July 2nd, 12 days before the attack on the Bastille, the authorities transferred the prisoner to the insane asylum at Charenton, after he falsely informed the citizenry that the prison authorities were executing the prisoners. Fitting for a notorious sadist and sexual deviant, he was dragged from the prison butt-ass naked, His personal effects remained in his rooms, which were sealed. The assault on the Bastille led to his effects being looted, including a library which he later claimed consisted of over 130 volumes, numerous manuscripts of his own creation, and several pieces of furniture. King Louis XVI of France made several mistakes over the spring and summer of 1789, which included the transfer of armed troops into Paris to protect the royal palace at the Tuileries, the firing of several ministers, and an ineffective response to the high price of bread. Bread shortages were the result of several failed harvests in a row. The French treasury was nearly destitute. Aid to the poor was financially impossible. Louis's government simply had no money. In July 1789, 2 days of rioting in the streets threatened to tear Paris apart. Government offices were overrun, looted, and documents and records destroyed. Gunsmiths and armories were looted. The church, a hated symbol of excess among the poor, was a particular target. The monastery at Saint-Lazare was looted for bread, clothing, and the communion plate. Notre Dame and other lesser churches were similarly targeted. On July 14th, the rioting crowds turned to the Bastille, ostensibly to seize the arms and supplies the leaders of the revolt believed were stored there. The commander of the Bastille, Bernard de Luynes, had been born within the facility, the son of a previous governor of the prison. At his command were 82 troops, all veterans, and all counted as invalids, meaning they were either too old or too infirm for frontline military service. They were supported by 32 Swiss guards, mercenaries from the same troop that guarded the Pope in Rome, as well as Louis XVI in France. The mob soon gained support from mutinous regiments of the French army, who sided with their commanders against the nobility. Faced with impossible odds and with limited means of defense at his disposal, de Luynes surrendered the post. He was taken to the Hôtel de Ville, the city hall of Paris, where he was murdered on the steps by the mob, though not before kicking an unfortunate pastry cook in the balls and screaming at the crowd, "Enough, let me die." His head, as well as the heads of other French authorities killed that day, was mounted on a pike and paraded through the streets of Paris by the mob. The French Revolution, which would become notorious for its unrestrained bloodletting, had begun. The mob found little in the Bastille in the way of immediate rewards for their actions. So, in other words, no loot. There was less than 2 days of food for the garrison in the fortress, little in the way of munitions, and as previously noted, just 7, some sources say 6, prisoners to set free. Most of the Swiss guards evaded capture, or likely worse, by removing their uniforms and melting into the crowd, later to rejoin their regiments. Speaking of the prisoners, as we alluded to in the intro, one in particular has a pretty amazing story. Jacques-François Xavier White, or as he was known before moving to France, James White, Irishman. So what was an Irishman doing in a notorious French prison? Well, not very much. Sent to prison by his own family, White was a few baguettes short of a buffet, and variously believed himself to be Julius Caesar and/or a literal saint. Upon being discovered by the mob, huddled in his cell and sporting a 3-foot-long beard, White was paraded through the streets as a hero, prompting White to declare himself the master of immensity, at which point he then beat and robbed a passerby. Realizing that he was probably in prison for a good reason, his liberators sent him to the same asylum as Sade. In total, he'd spent a single day as a free man. The day after the Bastille fell, Louis XVI withdrew all royal troops from Paris and accepted a red and blue cockade to wear as a symbol of his accord with the people. The Marquis de Lafayette spoke from the royal palace at Versailles, assuring the people that the king had been misled and that his heart was with them. Lafayette, a hero of the American Revolution, emerged as a leader of the French Revolution, accepting the command of the National Guard. As a symbol of Bourbon fealty to the revolution, Lafayette added white. Despite the assurances of Lafayette and Louis XVI, leaders of the insurgency in Paris could not abide the thought of troops loyal to the king reoccupying the fortress. On July 16th, the Comte d'Artois, heir apparent to the French throne, fled France with a large party of loyalists. Revolutionary leaders viewed his departure as being preliminary to his returning with supporting troops from other monarchs in Europe. It was decided to destroy the Bastille, and roughly 1,000 laborers were assigned to the task. Over the succeeding months, the fortress and prison was dismantled. A small amount of blasting using gunpowder was employed for the purpose, but gunpowder was scarce and needed by revolutionary troops. Most of the Bastille was demolished by hand, brick by brick, and stone by stone. It was during this destruction that the pro-revolutionary press described what became the historical reputation of the Bastille, with its torture chambers, dungeons, and isolated cells where prisoners had been abandoned to rot. Skeletal remains found within the prison, probably those of soldiers who had died there during the preceding centuries, were touted as the bones of prisoners murdered within the walls by the representatives of the old regime. Relics from the prison appeared for sale throughout France and beyond: scraps of wood, bricks, pieces of furniture, and other souvenirs. By November 1789, the Bastille was gone. One relic that survived was a wrought iron key described as the key to the main gate at Saint-Antoine. It was presented to Lafayette during the summer of 1789. The Marquis had the key shipped to George Washington, and the key arrived at New York, then the temporary capital of the United States, in March 1790. Washington kept the key in his offices when the capital moved to Philadelphia in late 1790, and then had it shipped to his home at Mount Vernon in Virginia in 1797. Where it was prominently displayed for the rest of his life. It remains there today, displayed in a glass case in the main hall of Washington's home, one of the few remaining pieces of the fortress and prison known as the Bastille. Well, I certainly hope you enjoyed this mad journey of a video, and if you did, be sure to do all that algorithmic jazz and keep it tuned here to Geographics for more just like this. I'm Eric Malachite, and I'll see you next time, Space Cowboy.